The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Denver as Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his rifle scope, watching the horizon for any sign of movement. 3 years had passed since the outbreak began, and humanity had been pushed to the brink of extinction. What started as isolated incidents in major cities had quickly spiraled into a global catastrophe that left civilization in ruins. The undead now outnumbered the living by an estimated ratio of 10,000 to 1, and the remaining survivors had been forced into heavily fortified settlements scattered across the continent. Marcus served as the head of reconnaissance for Haven Valley, one of the last major human strongholds in North America, home to nearly 15,000 survivors who had managed to carve out a precarious existence in the Colorado mountains. The settlement had been built around an old military installation, its concrete walls reinforced with scavenged materials and topped with razor wire that gleamed menacingly in the early light. Inside these walls, children who had never known a world without zombies played in carefully monitored courtyards while their parents worked tirelessly to maintain the generators, water purification systems, and hydroponic farms that kept their community alive. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the settlement's chief medical officer, had spent countless hours studying the infected, searching for any weakness that might give humanity an advantage in what many believed would be their final battle. Her research had revealed disturbing patterns in zombie behavior, suggesting that the creatures were evolving, becoming more organized and strategic in their attacks. Commander James Mitchell stood in the command center, studying satellite imagery that painted a grim picture of their situation. Massive hordes of zombies were converging from all directions, drawn by some unknown force toward the remaining human settlements. The largest horde, estimated at over 2 million infected, was moving steadily toward Haven Valley from the east, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Smaller groups were approaching from the north and south, creating what appeared to be a coordinated assault that defied everything they thought they knew about zombie behavior. The creatures seemed to be communicating somehow, working together with a level of intelligence that sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened survivors. Rebecca Thompson, a former CDC researcher who had become the settlement's strategic advisor, burst into the command center with urgent news from her monitoring station. Her equipment had detected unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from the approaching hordes, patterns that suggested the zombies were being controlled or influenced by some external force. The readings were unlike anything she had encountered during her years of studying the outbreak, and they seemed to be growing stronger as the hordes drew closer. This discovery added a terrifying new dimension to their predicament, raising questions about whether they were facing a natural evolution of the virus or something far more sinister. The settlement's defenses, while impressive, had never been tested against an assault of this magnitude. Captain David Foster, the head of security, had spent weeks preparing for the inevitable attack, coordinating with his team of former military personnel and civilian volunteers who had learned to fight out of necessity. They had stockpiled ammunition, reinforced weak points in the perimeter, and established fallback positions throughout the settlement. However, even their most optimistic projections suggested they could hold out for no more than 72 hours against the approaching tsunami of undead flesh. As news of the approaching horde spread throughout Haven Valley, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Families huddled together in their quarters, checking and rechecking their emergency supplies while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for their children. The settlement's workshops buzzed with activity as mechanics and engineers worked around the clock to prepare vehicles for a potential evacuation, though everyone knew that fleeing would likely mean certain death in the wasteland beyond their walls. The community's leaders had made the difficult decision to stand and fight, believing that Haven Valley represented humanity's best chance for long-term survival. Tommy Chin, a 17-year-old who had grown up in the settlement, volunteered for the dangerous mission of scouting the approaching eastern horde. Despite his youth, he had proven himself to be one of their most skilled reconnaissance operatives, capable of moving through zombie-infested territory with an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. His reports from the field painted an increasingly dire picture as he described the sheer scale of the approaching threat and the unsettling coordination he observed among the infected. The zombies moved with purpose, maintaining formation and responding to what appeared to be silent commands from larger, more evolved specimens that seemed to serve as leaders. The settlement's radio operators worked frantically to establish contact with other survivor communities, hoping to coordinate a joint defense or at least share intelligence about the unprecedented zombie behavior they were witnessing. Most of their calls went unanswered, suggesting that other settlements were either already overrun or facing similar threats. The few responses they received painted a bleak picture of humanity's situation, with reports of coordinated attacks occurring simultaneously across multiple continents. It became increasingly clear that this was not just a local phenomenon but part of a global event that could represent the final chapter in humanity's struggle for survival. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the settlement's walls, the defenders of Haven Valley prepared for what many believed would be their last stand. The approaching hordes were now visible on the horizon, a dark mass that seemed to stretch endlessly across the landscape, moving with inexorable purpose toward their sanctuary. The battle for humanity's future was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether the human race would survive to see another dawn or join the ranks of the walking dead that now dominated their world. The war room fell silent as Tommy Chen's voice crackled through the radio, his breathing heavy from exertion as he transmitted his latest reconnaissance report from a concealed position just 5 miles east of Haven Valley. The Eastern Horde had grown even larger than their initial estimates, now stretching across a front that spanned nearly 10 miles and moving with a coordination that defied all previous understanding of zombie behavior. Tommy described massive creatures he had never seen before, towering specimens that stood nearly 8 feet tall and appeared to be directing the movements of smaller groups with gestures and guttural sounds that carried across the wasteland like some primitive form of communication. These alpha zombies, as Dr. Warren had begun calling them, seemed to possess a level of intelligence that suggested the virus had undergone a dramatic mutation, creating a new breed of infected that could think, plan, and strategize. Commander Mitchell immediately ordered all non-essential personnel to begin moving to the underground bunkers that had been carved into the mountain beneath Haven Valley, a network of tunnels and chambers that could house the entire population for several weeks if necessary. The evacuation proceeded with practiced efficiency, families gathering their most precious possessions while trying to maintain calm for the sake of their children. Maria Santos, the settlement's head of civilian operations, coordinated the movement of supplies and equipment into the bunkers while ensuring that the community's most vulnerable members received priority access to the safest areas. The elderly and infirm were transported on stretchers, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and resignation as they were carried into the depths of their mountain fortress. Dr. Warren worked feverishly in her laboratory, analyzing blood samples from recently killed zombies that had been brought back by scouting parties over the past few weeks. Her microscopic examination revealed disturbing changes in the viral structure, mutations that seemed to be accelerating at an unprecedented rate. The virus was not only adapting to overcome human immune responses but was also developing new capabilities that enhanced the infected's physical strength, coordination, and cognitive function. Her findings suggested that the approaching horde represented an evolutionary leap that could make previous defensive strategies completely obsolete. She immediately began working on modifications to their existing weapons and ammunition, hoping to find new ways to exploit any weaknesses in the evolved zombies' physiology. Captain Foster assembled his defense teams on the settlement's walls, distributing the last of their heavy weapons and ammunition while reviewing their tactical plans one final time. The defenders included former soldiers, police officers, and civilians who had learned to fight during the 3 years since the outbreak began. Among them was Jake Morrison, a former Marine sniper who had lost his family in the early days of the pandemic and now fought with the cold precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. Beside him stood Angela Davis, a former SWAT officer who had become one of their most effective close-quarters combat specialists, her expertise crucial for defending the settlement's choke points and narrow passages. The settlement's engineers, led by Robert Kim, worked desperately to complete last-minute modifications to their defensive systems. They had rigged explosive charges at strategic points along the perimeter, creating kill zones that could be triggered remotely to thin the ranks of attacking zombies. Solar panels and wind turbines continued to power their electrical defenses, including high-voltage barriers and automated turrets that had been salvaged from military installations and repurposed for their current situation. However, everyone understood that these technological advantages would only delay the inevitable if the horde proved as large and organized as Tommy's report suggested. Rebecca Thompson's monitoring equipment detected increasingly powerful electromagnetic pulses emanating from the approaching zombies, signals that seemed to be growing stronger and more complex as the horde drew closer to Haven Valley. Her analysis suggested that the alpha zombies were not only communicating with each other but were also somehow coordinating with the smaller hordes approaching from the north and south. This level of strategic thinking represented a terrifying evolution in zombie behavior, suggesting that humanity was no longer facing mindless predators but an organized enemy capable of sophisticated military tactics. The implications were staggering, as it meant that traditional defensive strategies based on exploiting zombie predictability would be largely useless. As afternoon turned to evening, the settlement's lookouts reported that the northern and southern hordes had also increased their pace, moving with the same purposeful coordination observed in the Eastern group. The three forces appeared to be timing their approach to arrive simultaneously, creating a three-pronged assault that would stretch Haven Valley's defenses to the breaking point. Commander Mitchell realized that they were facing an enemy that understood the principles of military strategy, an adversary that had learned to exploit human weaknesses through observation and adaptation. The zombies were no longer simply following their hunger but were executing a calculated plan designed to overwhelm their defenses through superior numbers and tactical coordination. The settlement's children were gathered in the deepest part of the underground complex, where teachers and caregivers tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the approaching crisis. Story time continued in hushed voices while the sound of boots echoed through the tunnels above as defenders moved to their positions. Many of these children had never known a world without zombies, and their innocent questions about the sounds of preparation above served as a stark reminder of what humanity stood to lose if Haven Valley fell. Their parents fought not just for their own survival but for the hope that these children might one day inherit a world free from the walking dead. Dr. Warren made a breakthrough in her analysis, discovering that the evolved zombies showed increased vulnerability to certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. Working with the engineering team, she began developing a prototype weapon that could exploit this weakness, though time was running short to test and deploy such a device. The discovery offered a glimmer of hope, but implementing a solution would require resources and time that they might not have. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the settlement, the defenders of Haven Valley prepared for a night that would test everything they had learned about survival in a world dominated by the undead. The radio crackled with final reports from their outer perimeter scouts, confirming that the zombie hordes would reach their walls within hours. The battle for humanity's future was no longer a distant threat but an immediate reality that would determine whether the human race would survive to see another dawn. The first screams pierced the night air at exactly 11:47 p.m., echoing across Haven Valley as the outer perimeter sensors detected movement along the eastern approach. Tommy Chen's voice came through the radio one last time, his transmission cut short by the sound of gunfire and inhuman growls that sent chills through everyone listening in the command center. Commander Mitchell immediately activated the settlement's emergency protocols, and within minutes, every defender was at their assigned position along the walls while the last of the civilians disappeared into the underground bunkers. The floodlights illuminated the landscape beyond their defenses, revealing a sight that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. An endless sea of zombies stretching to the horizon, moving with the coordinated precision of a military formation rather than the chaotic shambling they had come to expect from the infected. Captain Foster watched through his night vision scope as the alpha zombies positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the horde, their towering forms clearly visible among the smaller infected as they directed the assault with gestures and vocalizations that carried across the wasteland like battlefield commands. These evolved specimens had learned to use the terrain to their advantage, positioning groups of zombies in ravines and behind rocky outcroppings where they could advance under cover before launching coordinated attacks against specific sections of the wall. The tactical sophistication displayed by the Horde was unlike anything the defenders had encountered, suggesting that the virus had not only enhanced the zombies' physical capabilities but had also granted them a collective intelligence that made them far more dangerous than individual infected. Dr. Warren's prototype electromagnetic weapon had been hastily mounted on the settlement's central tower, its experimental design untested but representing their best hope for exploiting the weakness she had discovered in the evolved zombies. The device hummed with electrical energy as she made final calibrations, knowing that they would have only one chance to determine whether her theory could be translated into an effective weapon. Robert Kim and his engineering team had worked through the night to integrate the device with their power grid, creating a system that could channel the settlement's entire electrical output through the weapon if necessary, though doing so would leave them vulnerable in other ways. The first wave struck the eastern wall with devastating force, hundreds of zombies throwing themselves against the electrified barriers while the alpha specimens hung back, observing the defenders' responses and adapting their tactics accordingly. Jake Morrison's sniper rifle cracked repeatedly as he targeted the larger zombies, his military training evident in the precision of his shots, but even headshots that would have instantly killed normal infected only seemed to slow down the evolved specimens. Angela Davis coordinated the close-quarters defense teams, her SWAT experience proving invaluable as she directed concentrated fire at the points where zombies managed to breach the outer barriers, but the sheer number of attackers made it impossible to stop them all. The northern and southern hordes launched their attacks simultaneously, creating the three-pronged assault that Commander Mitchell had feared, stretching their defensive capabilities beyond their limits as defenders were forced to divide their attention and resources among multiple fronts. The coordination between the three groups was perfect, with each horde timing their advances to prevent the humans from concentrating their firepower on any single threat. Rebecca Thompson's monitoring equipment detected intense electromagnetic activity as the alpha zombies communicated across vast distances, coordinating their assault with a level of strategic thinking that suggested they had been planning this attack for weeks or even months. The settlement's automated defenses activated as programmed, sending high-voltage electricity through the outer barriers and triggering explosive charges that created massive craters in the approaching zombie ranks, but the infected simply climbed over their fallen comrades and continued their relentless advance. The kill zones that had been so carefully prepared proved less effective than hoped, as the alpha zombies quickly identified the pattern of explosions and began directing their forces around the most dangerous areas. The zombies' ability to learn and adapt in real time transformed what should have been a decisive defensive advantage into merely a temporary obstacle. Maria Santos coordinated the evacuation of wounded defenders from the walls, her civilian operations team working under fire to ensure that injured personnel received immediate medical attention in the underground medical facility that Dr. Warren had established. The casualties mounted quickly as zombies began scaling the walls using crude ladders made from the bodies of their fallen comrades, a tactic that demonstrated not only their intelligence but also their complete disregard for individual survival in pursuit of their collective goal. The sight of zombies working together to overcome obstacles that would have stopped previous generations of infected filled the defenders with a dread that went beyond simple fear of death. As midnight approached, the first zombies breached the outer perimeter, pouring through gaps in the defenses that had been created by the coordinated assault from multiple directions. Captain Foster ordered the activation of the secondary defensive line, a series of choke points and kill zones within the settlement itself that had been designed to slow any zombies that managed to penetrate the outer walls. The fighting moved into the streets of Haven Valley, where every building had been fortified and every intersection had been prepared as a potential battlefield, but the defenders found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their tactics and counter them with disturbing effectiveness. Dr. Warren activated her electromagnetic weapon for the first time, sending a powerful pulse of energy across the battlefield that caused several alpha zombies to stumble and lose coordination, providing temporary relief to the overwhelmed defenders. The weapon's effect was immediate and dramatic, disrupting the zombies' communication network and causing confusion in their ranks, but the power drain was enormous, and she realized that they could only use the device sparingly without risking a complete power failure that would leave them defenseless. The brief respite allowed the defenders to regroup and reinforce their positions, but everyone understood that this was only the beginning of what promised to be a long and brutal battle. The radio crackled with reports from all three fronts as the night wore on, painting a picture of desperate fighting against overwhelming odds as the zombies continued to pour through the breaches in their defenses. The battle for Haven Valley had begun in earnest, and the outcome would determine not only the fate of the 15,000 survivors sheltering in the mountain bunkers but potentially the future of human civilization itself. Dawn broke over Haven Valley to reveal a settlement transformed into a war zone, with smoke rising from burning buildings and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the stench of decomposing flesh that permeated the morning air. Commander Mitchell surveyed the battlefield from his command post, his face grim as he assessed the damage from the night's fighting. The outer perimeter had been completely overrun, and zombies now controlled nearly a third of the settlement's surface area, forcing the defenders to fall back to increasingly desperate positions within their own home. The casualty reports painted a devastating picture. They had lost over 200 defenders during the night, including some of their most experienced fighters, while the zombie horde seemed to have suffered minimal losses despite the thousands that had been destroyed by explosives and gunfire. Captain Foster limped through the rubble-strewn streets, his left arm in a makeshift sling after a close encounter with one of the alpha zombies that had nearly cost him his life. The evolved specimens had proven even more dangerous in close combat than anticipated, possessing not only enhanced strength and speed but also a cunning intelligence that allowed them to set traps and ambushes for unwary defenders. His remaining security teams had been forced to abandon several key defensive positions during the night, retreating deeper into the settlement while leaving behind carefully prepared fortifications that the zombies now occupied like conquering soldiers claiming enemy territory. Dr. Warren worked frantically in her laboratory, which had been relocated to the underground complex after zombies overran the surface medical facility, analyzing tissue samples from the alpha zombies that had been collected during the fighting. Her examination revealed that these evolved specimens possessed a completely restructured nervous system that allowed for rapid communication and coordination, essentially creating a hive mind that connected individual zombies into a collective intelligence. The implications were staggering, as it meant that every zombie in the Horde had access to the tactical knowledge and battlefield experience of the entire group, making them exponentially more dangerous than the sum of their individual parts. The settlement's children huddled in the deepest chambers of the underground complex, their frightened whispers echoing through the tunnels as the sounds of battle filtered down from above. Many had lost parents during the night's fighting, and the teachers and caregivers struggled to maintain order while dealing with their own grief and terror. Sarah Mitchell, the commander's teenage daughter, had volunteered to help care for the younger children despite her own fear, reading stories and leading songs in an attempt to distract them from the horror unfolding above their heads. Her courage in the face of overwhelming despair served as an inspiration to the adults around her, reminding them of what they were fighting to preserve. Rebecca Thompson's electromagnetic monitoring equipment detected a disturbing new development in the zombie communication patterns, suggesting that the alpha specimens were calling for reinforcements from other hordes scattered across the region. The signals were being transmitted across vast distances, potentially reaching infected populations hundreds of miles away and drawing them toward Haven Valley like a beacon. This discovery meant that even if they somehow managed to defeat the current assault, they would soon face an even larger force as every zombie within a 1,000-mile radius converged on their location, attracted by whatever signal the alphas were broadcasting. Jake Morrison had established a sniper's nest in the settlement's clock tower, one of the few remaining elevated positions that offered a clear view of the zombie-controlled areas. His rifle had claimed dozens of alpha zombies during the night, but for every one he eliminated, 2 more seemed to take its place, emerging from the endless ranks of infected that continued to pour through the breached perimeter. His ammunition was running dangerously low, and he knew that once his bullets were exhausted, the tower would become a death trap rather than a strategic advantage, but he continued to fire with mechanical precision, each shot representing another few minutes of survival for the people below. Angela Davis led a desperate counterattack to retake the settlement's armory, which had been overrun during the early hours of the assault, taking with it most of their heavy weapons and explosive devices. Her team of volunteers moved through the zombie-infested streets using guerrilla tactics, striking quickly at isolated groups of infected before melting back into the ruins of their former home. The mission was crucial to their survival, as the weapons stored in the armory represented their only hope of mounting an effective defense against the next wave of attacks. But the building was now surrounded by hundreds of zombies that seemed to understand its strategic importance. Robert Kim and his engineering team worked desperately to restore power to sections of the settlement where the electrical grid had been damaged by the fighting, knowing that their automated defenses were useless without electricity to operate them. They crawled through maintenance tunnels and utility corridors, repairing damaged cables and replacing destroyed components while zombies prowled the streets above their heads. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but their efforts were essential to maintaining any hope of holding their remaining defensive positions against the next assault that everyone knew was coming. Dr. Warren made a breakthrough in her analysis of the alpha zombie tissue samples, discovering that the electromagnetic pulses from her weapon had caused significant damage to the creature's enhanced nervous systems, though not enough to kill them outright. Working with Robert Kim's team, she began developing a more powerful version of the device that could potentially disrupt the entire Horde's communication network, but the power requirements would be enormous, possibly requiring them to overload their entire electrical system in a single devastating attack. The weapon represented their best hope for victory, but using it would leave them completely defenseless if it failed to eliminate the zombie threat entirely. As the morning progressed, the defenders of Haven Valley found themselves pushed back to their final defensive line, a series of reinforced positions surrounding the entrance to the underground complex where the civilian population had taken shelter. The zombies controlled most of the settlement's surface area, and their alpha leaders had begun organizing systematic searches of every building and tunnel, hunting for any humans who might be hiding in the ruins. The situation had become desperate beyond anything they had previously imagined, and Commander Mitchell knew that they had perhaps hours before their defenses collapsed entirely, leaving 15,000 innocent people at the mercy of an enemy that showed no mercy at all. The radio crackled with increasingly frantic reports from the few remaining observation posts, confirming that additional zombie hordes were approaching from the west and southwest, drawn by the electromagnetic signals that continued to emanate from the alpha specimens. The final battle for Haven Valley was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether humanity's last major stronghold would survive to fight another day or join the countless other settlements that had fallen to the ever-growing army of the undead. The situation reached its breaking point when Angela Davis and her team successfully fought their way into the armory, only to discover that the zombies had somehow learned to operate the heavy weapons they had captured, with alpha specimens directing groups of infected in the systematic destruction of the settlement's remaining defenses. Commander Mitchell watched in horror through his binoculars as zombies wielded rocket launchers and machine guns with disturbing proficiency, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to understand and utilize human technology in ways that defied everything the survivors thought they knew about the infected. The sight of zombies operating military equipment with tactical precision marked a terrifying evolution in the conflict, transforming the undead from mindless predators into a sophisticated enemy capable of matching human technological advantages. Dr. Warren's enhanced electromagnetic weapon neared completion in the underground laboratory, but the power requirements had proven even more demanding than initially calculated, requiring them to channel not only the settlement's entire electrical grid but also the backup generators and even the power cells from their vehicles into a single devastating pulse. Robert Kim warned that the energy discharge would likely destroy most of their electronic equipment and leave them without power for days, but everyone understood that they would not survive long enough for that to matter unless the weapon succeeded in disrupting the zombie hive mind. The device represented their final gambit, a desperate all-or-nothing attempt to level the playing field against an enemy that had systematically countered every other strategy they had employed. The western and southwestern zombie hordes arrived at Haven Valley just after noon, swelling the ranks of the attacking force to an estimated 4 million infected, a number so vast that it seemed to cover the entire landscape like a living carpet of death and decay. Rebecca Thompson's monitoring equipment detected that the electromagnetic signals connecting the various hordes had grown exponentially stronger, creating a communication network that spanned hundreds of miles and allowed for coordination on a scale that suggested the zombies were operating as a single massive organism rather than individual creatures. The arrival of reinforcements had transformed what was already a desperate situation into something that appeared utterly hopeless, as the defenders found themselves outnumbered by a ratio that made meaningful resistance seem impossible. Captain Foster organized the evacuation of the settlement's final surface positions, pulling his remaining fighters back to the heavily fortified entrance of the underground complex where they would make their last stand. The retreat was conducted under heavy fire from zombie-operated weapons, with alpha specimens demonstrating an understanding of military tactics that included flanking maneuvers, suppressing fire, and coordinated assaults that would have been impressive even for human soldiers. The defenders lost another 50 fighters during the withdrawal, leaving them with fewer than 300 combat-effective personnel to defend against millions of attacking zombies, odds that would have been laughable if the situation had not been so desperately serious. Maria Santos coordinated the final preparations in the underground complex, ensuring that the civilian population was moved to the deepest and most secure chambers while emergency supplies were distributed to last for several weeks if necessary. The children were gathered in the central chamber, where the settlement's teachers continued their efforts to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the sounds of battle echoing through the tunnels above. Many families said what they believed would be their final goodbyes, parents embracing their children while trying to hide their own terror and despair, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether any of them would live to see another day. Jake Morrison abandoned his sniper position in the clock tower as zombies finally overran the building, fighting his way through hordes of infected to reach the underground entrance where the final defensive line was being established. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and his rifle barrel was so hot from continuous firing that it had begun to warp, but he continued to engage targets with the grim determination of someone who understood that every zombie he killed might buy precious seconds for the civilians below. The tower's fall marked the loss of their last elevated observation post, leaving the defenders blind to zombie movements across most of the settlement's surface area. Dr. Warren made final adjustments to her electromagnetic weapon while Robert Kim's team completed the power connections that would channel every available volt of electricity through the device in a single massive pulse. The weapon had been positioned at the entrance to the underground complex, where it could target the largest concentration of alpha zombies that were directing the assault on their final defensive position. The timing would be critical, as they would have only one opportunity to fire the device before the power drain left them completely defenseless, and failure would mean the immediate overrun of their last sanctuary by millions of infected who would show no mercy to the civilians sheltering below. The zombie assault on the underground entrance began with a coordinated attack that demonstrated the full extent of their evolved tactical capabilities, with alpha specimens directing waves of infected in precisely timed assaults designed to overwhelm specific sections of the defensive line. The defenders found themselves facing an enemy that had learned from every previous engagement, adapting their tactics to counter human strategies with a speed and efficiency that was both impressive and terrifying. Explosives that had been effective earlier in the battle were now anticipated and avoided, while defensive positions that should have been impregnable were systematically dismantled by zombies who had learned to work together with the coordination of a professional military unit. Angela Davis led a series of desperate counterattacks to buy time for Dr. Warren's weapon preparations, her SWAT training proving invaluable as she coordinated small teams of defenders in hit-and-run tactics designed to disrupt zombie formations and eliminate key alpha specimens. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, with defenders using knives, axes, and improvised weapons when their ammunition ran out, but the zombies' enhanced strength and coordination made every engagement a life-or-death struggle that claimed more human lives with each passing hour. The defensive line contracted steadily as positions became untenable, forcing the survivors into an ever-smaller perimeter around the entrance to their underground sanctuary. As afternoon turned to evening, Commander Mitchell realized that they had perhaps an hour before their defenses collapsed entirely, leaving the civilian population at the mercy of an enemy that had demonstrated both the intelligence to coordinate complex military operations and the ruthlessness to show no quarter to human survivors. The electromagnetic weapon represented their final hope, but its untested nature meant that they were gambling everything on a device that might fail to function at the critical moment. The fate of Haven Valley and possibly the future of human civilization now rested on a desperate scientific experiment that would either save them all or mark the end of their resistance against the ever-growing army of the undead. The electromagnetic weapon discharged at precisely 6:23 p.m., sending a massive pulse of energy across Haven Valley that caused every piece of electronic equipment in the settlement to spark and fail while simultaneously disrupting the zombie communication network in a way that exceeded even Dr. Warren's most optimistic projections. The effect was immediate and dramatic, with alpha zombies throughout the Horde suddenly collapsing as their enhanced nervous systems overloaded, while the millions of smaller infected began wandering aimlessly without the coordinated direction they had relied upon throughout the assault. The pulse had essentially severed the connections that bound the zombie hive mind together, transforming a sophisticated military force back into individual creatures driven only by basic hunger and instinct, though the defenders had no way of knowing how long this advantage would last. Commander Mitchell watched through the smoke and darkness as the zombie assault faltered, their coordinated attacks dissolving into chaotic wandering as individual infected lost the collective intelligence that had made them so dangerous. Captain Foster immediately recognized the opportunity and ordered his remaining fighters to launch a counterattack, leading them out of their defensive positions to engage the confused and disorganized zombies while they still maintained the element of surprise. The battle that followed was unlike anything they had experienced during the siege, with human tactical superiority finally proving decisive against an enemy that had suddenly lost its greatest advantage, though everyone understood that they were racing against time before the zombies adapted to their new circumstances. Angela Davis led her team in a systematic clearing operation, moving through the settlement streets and buildings to eliminate zombies that were now vulnerable to traditional combat tactics, her SWAT experience proving invaluable as she coordinated precise strikes against isolated groups of infected. The absence of alpha zombie coordination meant that the undead could no longer set traps or ambushes, reverting to the predictable behavior patterns that human survivors had learned to exploit during the early years of the outbreak. Her team reclaimed key positions throughout the settlement, including the armory and several strategic observation posts, though the sheer number of zombies still present meant that the clearing operation would take days to complete. Jake Morrison emerged from the underground complex with a salvaged rifle and began picking off zombies from elevated positions, his military training allowing him to identify and eliminate the few remaining alpha specimens that had survived the electromagnetic pulse. These evolved zombies appeared to be attempting to re-establish communication with their scattered forces, and preventing them from succeeding became a critical priority for maintaining the tactical advantage that the pulse had created. Each alpha zombie that Morrison eliminated represented hundreds or thousands of infected that would remain disorganized and vulnerable to conventional defensive tactics, making his precision shooting essential to their continued survival. Dr. Warren worked frantically to restore power to essential systems using backup generators and salvaged equipment, knowing that their electromagnetic weapon had been a one-time use device that had destroyed itself in the process of firing. Her analysis of the pulse's effects suggested that the disruption to the zombie communication network might be temporary, with the creature's enhanced biology potentially allowing them to recover and re-establish their hive mind within hours or days. The race was now on to eliminate as many zombies as possible while they remained disorganized, and to prepare new defenses for the possibility that the alpha specimens might eventually recover their coordination abilities. Rebecca Thompson's monitoring equipment had been destroyed by the electromagnetic pulse, leaving them blind to any attempts by the zombies to re-establish their communication network, but the absence of coordinated attacks suggested that the disruption had been more complete than they had dared to hope. Working with Robert Kim's engineering team, she began constructing new detection equipment from salvaged components, knowing that early warning of any recovery in zombie coordination would be essential for their survival. The settlement's electronic infrastructure had been devastated by the pulse, but the trade-off had been worthwhile if it meant breaking the zombie hive mind permanently. Maria Santos coordinated the gradual return of civilian personnel to the surface levels of the settlement, though most families remained in the underground complex until the clearing operations could be completed and the area declared secure. The children who had spent days in the tunnels emerged blinking into the smoky daylight, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and confusion as they tried to understand why the terrifying sounds of battle had suddenly stopped. The psychological impact of the siege had been enormous, and Santos knew that rebuilding their community would require not only physical reconstruction but also extensive efforts to help people recover from the trauma they had experienced. The counterattack continued through the night, with teams of defenders working in shifts to maintain pressure on the disorganized zombie forces while avoiding the exhaustion that had. The full scope of Haven Valley's losses became apparent as the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, revealing a settlement that had paid an enormous price for its survival against the zombie horde. Commander Mitchell walked through streets littered with the bodies of both defenders and infected, his face reflecting the weight of command as he surveyed the devastation that had befallen his community. The casualty reports painted a grim picture. Over 400 defenders had been killed during the siege, including many of the settlement's most experienced fighters and essential personnel, while hundreds more had been wounded and would require extensive medical care that strained their limited resources. The human cost of victory had been staggering, leaving families shattered and the community's leadership structure severely weakened at a time when strong organization would be crucial for recovery. Dr. Warren established a field hospital in the settlement's main square, working alongside the few remaining medical personnel to treat the wounded while simultaneously conducting autopsies on the alpha zombies to better understand the effects of the electromagnetic pulse. Her examination revealed that the evolved specimens had suffered massive neurological damage that appeared to be permanent, with their enhanced nervous systems completely destroyed by the energy discharge. However, she also discovered disturbing evidence that some alpha zombies had begun showing signs of recovery in the hours before they were eliminated, suggesting that the electromagnetic weapons' effects might not be as permanent as they had hoped, and that future encounters with evolved zombies would require new strategies and weapons. The settlement's infrastructure had been devastated by both the zombie assault and their own electromagnetic weapon, leaving them without power, communications, or automated defenses at a time when they were most vulnerable to additional attacks. Robert Kim's engineering team worked around the clock to restore essential systems using salvaged components and backup generators, but the damage was so extensive that full restoration would take months of intensive labor. The irony was not lost on anyone that their greatest victory had also left them more vulnerable than they had been since the settlement's founding, forcing them to rely on manual labor and primitive defenses while they rebuilt their technological capabilities. Captain Foster organized burial details to handle the massive number of corpses that threatened to create a public health crisis if not properly disposed of, a task made more difficult by the fact that many of the bodies were too damaged or decomposed for individual identification. The defenders who had fallen during the siege were given proper military honors despite the circumstances, their sacrifices recognized by a community that understood the debt they owed to those who had given their lives to protect the innocent. The zombie corpses presented a different challenge, requiring careful handling to prevent the spread of infection while disposing of remains that numbered in the tens of thousands across the settlement and surrounding areas. Rebecca Thompson worked to re-establish communication with other survivor settlements, using a combination of salvaged radio equipment and improvised antennas to broadcast news of their victory and the discovery of the electromagnetic weapon's effectiveness against evolved zombies. The responses she received painted a mixed picture of humanity's situation across the continent, with some communities reporting similar coordinated attacks by evolved zombies while others remained unaware of the new threat that was spreading across the infected population. The intelligence gathered through these communications suggested that Haven Valley's battle had been part of a larger coordinated assault on human settlements, making their victory even more significant for the survival of the species. Maria Santos coordinated the return of civilian families to their homes, though many buildings had been damaged or destroyed during the fighting, leaving hundreds of people homeless within their own settlement. The psychological trauma of the siege was evident in both children and adults, with many survivors showing signs of severe stress and depression that would require ongoing support and counseling. The community's social fabric had been strained to the breaking point, and Santos knew that rebuilding their society would be as challenging as reconstructing their physical infrastructure, requiring careful attention to the emotional and psychological needs of people who had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Jake Morrison volunteered to lead scouting expeditions into the surrounding area to assess the threat posed by any remaining zombie forces and to search for other survivors who might have been displaced by the massive horde movements. His reconnaissance revealed that the electromagnetic pulse had affected zombies across a much wider area than anticipated, with reports of disorganized infected wandering aimlessly for miles in every direction from Haven Valley. The discovery suggested that their weapon had disrupted zombie communication, plagued them during the initial siege. The absence of coordinated zombie resistance meant that human forces could finally employ the tactical advantages that their training and intelligence provided, using flanking maneuvers, concentrated firepower, and strategic positioning to eliminate large numbers of infected with minimal casualties. The tide of battle had turned decisively in humanity's favor, though the enormous number of zombies still present meant that the clearing operation would be a long and dangerous process. Captain Foster established a new command post in the reclaimed clock tower, from which he could coordinate the systematic elimination of zombie forces throughout the settlement and the surrounding area. His teams reported steady progress in clearing buildings and securing key infrastructure, though they continued to encounter pockets of zombies that had become trapped in basements, storage areas, and other confined spaces where they posed less immediate threat but still required careful elimination. The settlement's defensive perimeter was gradually being re-established, with work crews following behind the combat teams to repair damaged walls and restore automated defenses. As dawn broke over Haven Valley for the second time since the siege began, the defenders found themselves in control of most of their settlement for the first time in over 36 hours, though the landscape bore the scars of the brutal battle that had nearly destroyed their community. Thousands of zombie corpses littered the streets and surrounding areas, creating a massive cleanup and disposal problem that would take weeks to address, but the immediate threat had been neutralized through the desperate gambit that had risked everything on an untested weapon. The electromagnetic pulse had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, breaking the zombie hive mind and returning the tactical advantage to human defenders who had learned to fight and survive in a world dominated by the undead. The victory at Haven Valley represented more than just the survival of one settlement. It had demonstrated that the evolved zombies were not invincible and that human ingenuity could still find ways to overcome even the most sophisticated threats posed by the infected. Word of their success would need to be transmitted to other survivor communities, sharing the knowledge that could help turn the tide in humanity's favor across the globe. Networks across the entire region, potentially saving other communities from coordinated attacks while creating opportunities for human forces to eliminate large numbers of confused and vulnerable infected. The settlement's food production facilities had been severely damaged during the siege, with hydroponic farms destroyed and livestock killed, creating an immediate crisis that threatened the community's long-term survival even after the zombie threat had been neutralized. Emergency rationing was implemented while work crews attempted to restore agricultural capabilities, but the damage was so extensive that Haven Valley would need to rely on scavenging and trade with other settlements to meet their basic nutritional needs for the foreseeable future. The irony of surviving the zombie assault only to face potential starvation was not lost on the community's leaders, who understood that victory in battle meant nothing if they could not sustain their population through the difficult months ahead. Angela Davis took charge of training new defenders to replace those lost during the siege, working with civilian volunteers who had shown courage during the crisis to create a new generation of fighters capable of protecting the settlement against future threats. The training was intensive and urgent, as everyone understood that their electromagnetic weapon had been a one-time advantage that could not be relied upon in future conflicts with evolved zombies. The new recruits would need to master traditional combat techniques while also learning to adapt to the changing nature of the zombie threat, preparing for enemies that might possess intelligence and coordination capabilities that exceeded even the alpha specimens they had recently defeated. As the day progressed, Commander Mitchell called a meeting of the settlement's surviving leadership to discuss their long-term strategy for recovery and defense, knowing that their victory at Haven Valley had likely made them a target for future zombie attacks while simultaneously establishing them as a beacon of hope for human resistance. The decisions made in the coming days would determine not only whether their community could survive and rebuild but also whether they could serve as a model for other settlements facing similar threats. The battle for Haven Valley had been won, but the war for humanity's future was far from over, and the survivors knew that their greatest challenges might still lie ahead as they worked to rebuild their shattered world while preparing for the next wave of evolved zombies that would inevitably come. 3 months after the siege of Haven Valley, the settlement had transformed from a war-torn battlefield into a thriving beacon of human resilience and innovation, though the scars of that desperate battle remained visible in both the rebuilt structures and the faces of those who had survived. Commander Mitchell stood atop the newly constructed observation tower, watching as construction crews put the finishing touches on an expanded defensive perimeter that incorporated lessons learned from their encounter with the evolved zombies. The settlement now housed over 20,000 survivors, as word of their victory had spread across the continent and drawn refugees from communities that had fallen to coordinated zombie attacks, creating both opportunities and challenges as they worked to integrate newcomers while maintaining the security and stability that had made their survival possible. Dr. Warren's research laboratory had become the centerpiece of a new scientific initiative dedicated to understanding and combating the evolving zombie threat, with her electromagnetic weapons serving as the foundation for a new generation of defensive technologies that were being shared with allied settlements across North America. Her team had successfully developed portable versions of the electromagnetic pulse device, allowing smaller communities to defend themselves against alpha zombies while also creating the possibility of coordinated human offensives against major zombie strongholds. The breakthrough had fundamentally altered the balance of power in humanity's struggle for survival, providing hope that the species might not only survive but eventually reclaim their world from the undead hordes that had dominated it for so long. The settlement's communication network had expanded to include regular contact with over 50 other survivor communities, creating an informal alliance that shared intelligence, resources, and tactical innovations in the ongoing fight against the infected. Rebecca Thompson coordinated these communications from a state-of-the-art facility that monitored zombie movements across the continent while also serving as an early warning system for communities threatened by coordinated attacks. The network had already prevented several settlements from being overrun by providing advance notice of approaching hordes, while also facilitating the evacuation of civilians from areas that could not be defended against overwhelming zombie forces. Captain Foster had established a military academy within Haven Valley, training defenders not only from their own community but also from allied settlements that sent their best fighters to learn advanced combat techniques and tactical strategies. The curriculum included everything from traditional marksmanship and close-quarters combat to specialized training in fighting evolved zombies and operating the new electromagnetic weapons that were becoming standard equipment for human forces. The academy had become a symbol of humanity's determination to fight back against the zombie threat, producing a new generation of warriors who understood that their species' survival depended on their ability to adapt and overcome increasingly sophisticated enemies. Angela Davis led the settlement's first major offensive operation, a carefully planned assault on a zombie stronghold that had been identified as a breeding ground for alpha specimens, demonstrating that human forces could now take the initiative rather than simply defending against zombie attacks. The mission was a complete success, eliminating hundreds of evolved zombies while capturing valuable intelligence about the creature's behavior and biology that would inform future operations. The psychological impact of the victory was enormous, proving to both defenders and civilians that humanity was no longer merely surviving but was actively fighting to reclaim their world from the forces that had nearly destroyed it. Jake Morrison had become the leader of a specialized reconnaissance unit that operated far beyond the settlement's borders, gathering intelligence on zombie movements while also searching for other survivor communities that might benefit from Haven Valley's technological innovations and tactical expertise. His teams had discovered several previously unknown settlements that had managed to survive in isolation, bringing them into the growing network of allied communities while also identifying new threats that required coordinated responses. The expansion of human territory and influence represented a fundamental shift in the post-apocalyptic landscape, with organized human forces beginning to challenge zombie dominance in regions that had been considered permanently lost. The settlement's agricultural programs had not only recovered from the damage inflicted during the siege but had expanded to include experimental crops and livestock breeding programs designed to maximize food production in the challenging conditions of the post-apocalyptic world. Maria Santos oversaw these efforts while also managing the complex logistics of supporting a population that had grown dramatically as refugees continued to arrive from across the continent. The success of these programs had made Haven Valley largely self-sufficient while also allowing them to provide food aid to struggling allied communities, strengthening the bonds that held the human resistance together. Robert Kim's engineering teams had developed new construction techniques that incorporated zombie-resistant materials and designs, creating buildings and infrastructure that could withstand both conventional attacks and the specialized tactics employed by evolved zombies. These innovations were being shared with other settlements through detailed blueprints and training programs, allowing human communities to rebuild with confidence that their new structures would provide genuine protection against future threats. The architectural revolution represented another example of how humanity was adapting and evolving in response to the challenges posed by the zombie apocalypse. The children of Haven Valley attended schools that taught not only traditional subjects but also survival skills, zombie biology, and the history of the outbreak that had shaped their world, ensuring that future generations would be prepared to continue the fight for human survival and eventual victory. Sarah Mitchell had become one of the settlement's most effective teachers, using her own experiences during the siege to help students understand both the dangers they faced and the importance of courage, cooperation, and innovation in overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. The education system represented an investment in humanity's future, preparing young people to inherit a world that their parents and grandparents were working to reclaim from the forces of death and decay. As Commander Mitchell watched the sun set over Haven Valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that seemed to symbolize both the destruction of the past and the hope of the future, he reflected on how far they had come since that desperate night when millions of zombies had threatened to overwhelm their defenses and extinguish one of humanity's last flames of civilization. The settlement had become more than just a refuge for survivors. It had evolved into the capital of a growing human resistance movement that was slowly but steadily pushing back against the zombie hordes that had once seemed invincible. The final showdown between humans and zombies was far from over, but for the first time since the outbreak began, humanity was winning, and the future belonged to the living rather than the dead. The battle for Haven Valley had marked the turning point in humanity's darkest hour, proving that courage, ingenuity, and determination could overcome even the most terrifying threats, and that the human spirit would never surrender as long as there were people willing to fight for the future of their species.